Now it's finally time to use the login API that we built in previous sections. And there is a ton of stuff to do here in order to make the front end interact with the back end. And so we're doing this in separate lectures. Anyway, let's now get started. And this is how it's going to work. So we're going to allow users to log into our website by doing an HTTP request, or an AJAX call, as many people like to call it also. And we're doing that HTTP request to the login API endpoint that we implemented before, using the data that the user provides in this form that we have here. So remember that our API will then send back a cookie, which automatically gets stored in the browser, and also automatically gets sent back with each subsequent request. And as you will see, this is a fundamental key in order to make our authentication system work. But anyway, since we're doing this HTTP request in the browser, we will, of course, again be working on the client side. But anyway, since we're doing an HTTP request in the browser, we'll still be working on client-side JavaScript code. So just like we did with the Mapbox implementation. Alright, so let's now go ahead and create a new file here. And so that's in public JS and new file, which I'm going to call login.js. And in the next video, we're actually going to bundle all these separate JavaScript files that we're creating here for the front end together into one big bundle. Alright, but for now, let's actually just focus on making this logging functionality work. But anyway, let's now start by adding an event listener listening for the submit event on our login form. Okay, so our login form has this form class here. Okay, and so let's now select this form element and then on there listen for the submit event. And I hope that you're familiar with this kind of logic in client-side JavaScript, and so hopefully this is nothing new for you. So document.querySelector, which we use in order to select based on a class, and then that selector name. And now add event listener listening for the submit event. So basically an event that the browser will fire off whenever a user clicks on the submit button on the form. And then in the callback function, we're going to have access to that event itself. Okay, and so the first thing that we actually do is to say event.prevent default. Okay, so this prevents the form from loading any other page. Next up, let's actually get the email and the password value that the user puts in. And so these are in this element with the ID email and the ID password. Okay, so these two input fields. And so let's get this data as well. So document get element by ID, email, and then we use the value property in order to read that value out there, and not node value, just value. Let's duplicate this line. Okay, and so now let's do the actual logging in a separate function. Okay, now we get here this ESLint error, and that's again because we have ESLint only configured for Node.js code. And so let's actually disable that, just like we did here. So just grab this piece of code. All right. And now, as I was saying, let's now create that login function. So just like this. And this function is going to accept an email and a password. And first of all, let's just see if this code is actually working. And so we're going to alert. So basically create an alert window with this email and password. All right. Now, of course, we also need to call this function again with email and password. And then finally, we also need to include this logging file into our base template. All right. And again, as I was saying in the beginning, In the next video, we're going to bundle all of this front-end code here together into one big JavaScript file. Alright, so that's a lot better for performance, and it's also a better developer experience for ourselves. Anyway, this should now be working. Let's just reload this page here. So I have to fill in valid data here. Anyway, Chrome will not even allow me to submit the form. Alright, so here we get our alert with the email we just put in, and then the password, I guess, doesn't show up because we kind of specified two values there. So instead, let's specify an object here and see if it works then again. Well, I guess it tries to convert that object to a string here. Okay, but it doesn't really matter here. I'm usually more used to using console log instead of alert. Alright. But anyway, I'm sure it's working now here. And so let's now go ahead and actually create this function. So in order to do these HTTP requests for the login, we are going to use a very popular library called Axios. Okay. And in the next video, we're actually going to download this library from NPM and then bundle it together with all our other scripts. But for now, let's use it from a CDN. So let's just Google Axios CDN. All right. Then go ahead and copy this one here. And then in our base script, let's put it right here at the first one. All right, and so this will then expose an Axios object to the global scope, which we can then use in our login function. Okay, and so we can now say Axios and then pass in the options for our request. So first off, let's say that we're doing a post request. Then we need a URL. All right, so let's actually get that from Postman. So this is our URL here. And we're also going to, of course, append the host then on there. So then here, of course, it is HTTP and then localhost, basically. And so this is our login endpoint. And now we need to specify the data that we're sending along with the request in the body. All right, and so that is email equal to email, and so as you already know, we can remove this email. Okay, so it's called email here because our endpoint expects the data to be called email, right? So that's what we have here in the body. We need to specify a property called email and one called password, and so that's exactly what we're doing here, but it then has the same name as this parameter here. And so it's enough to just say email, and the same applies for the password. Okay, now Axios here then returns a promise, and so let's actually use async await in order to wait for that value to come back. So await here, and then async right here. Now keep in mind that this is client-facing code, and only the more modern browsers can actually run async await functions. But in this course, I'm not really going to go into that. Okay. Anyway, let's save the result of this awaiting the promise into the result variable. And then just to take a look at the result, let's say console.log result. Okay. Now, one thing that I really like about Axios is the fact that it's going to throw an error whenever we get an error back from our API endpoint. So let's say that there is a wrong password, and so the server will send back a 403, and so basically an error. And so whenever there is an error, Axios will trigger an error as well. And so that's very handy, because with that, we can now use a try catch block. Okay, so basically in order to do some error handling here on the client side. So for example, when the user is correctly logged in, then we want to display some message saying that and maybe some other logic. But if not, well, then we're going to be entering the catch block and can then take some other action based on the error. So let's take a look at the error as well. And just to make sure, I also want to log the email and password to the console. So let's try that here. Reload our page. And I'm putting a wrong password in now, okay? Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's take a look at our console here as well. And we get this error here from Mapbox.js, but don't worry about that. We're going to fix that a bit later again. But for now, let's take a look at what happens here. And here we get some nice error. All right. And so actually what we need to take a look at here is error.response and then point data. Okay. And you will find this here in the Axis documentation in case you're wondering where that is coming from. All right. Let me actually just go ahead and copy this email because it's not so good to always write it out manually. And now we actually get some nicely formatted error here. Okay, and so this is basically exactly the JSON code that we send back from our server, right? So this is exactly the same as we've been seeing in Postman. So we get our entire error, the message, and also the stack. And so we see that we probably didn't provide the email and password correctly for some reason. So let's go back, take a look. Oh, so I did something weird here where I passed in an object with both the email and the password. And so I think that's from before where I tried to do that alert, and I guess I did this in the wrong place. And so that's why we actually saw undefined here. And then here we got this object. So basically email was this entire object and password was then this undefined. Okay, so now this should fix it. Give it a reload. And now we get this correct error that we were actually expecting. So now it's an incorrect email or password because I specified a wrong password. All right, but now let's actually remove the 5. And so then test 1, 2, 3, 4 should be correct. So let's log in. And now we get a 200 response. So a successful one. So let's open this. And what we are actually interested in is the data. So basically response.data, because this is then actually where our JSON response is located. So here we get this data here, and we also get the status and the token. And so this is here our correct JSON Web Token corresponding to this logged in user. Now what's really interesting is to take a look at our cookies. And we do that in Google Chrome at least by clicking on this icon here, and then down here you have the cookies. And it also says that our connection is not secure, and that's simply because we're not using HTTPS at this point. But never mind about that. What matters here is that we now have this cookie, and indeed it is called JSON Web Token, and it has exactly the JSON Web Token that we see down here. So this is only the end basically of the string, so you see that this is equal to what we have down here. And it's this cookie here who will actually enable us to build this entire authentication. Again, because the browser will now send this cookie along with every new request. And let me actually show that to you in our backend. So let's go back here And let's go to app.js. And so now we're back in our Node, or actually in our Express code. Now, in order to actually get access to the cookies that are in a request, in Express we need to install a certain middleware. And so we need to install that from an npm package. And so let's again come to our other terminal and then npm install the cookie parser. Okay, so basically this package will then parse all the cookies from the incoming request. Cookie parser. All right, and now let's actually use it close to this body parser. Okay, so these two are very similar. This first one parses the data from the body, and the second one parses the data from cookies. And so now, if in this middleware here, we can use request.cookies. And so now, for each request, we will always display all the cookies in the console. So, if we now reload this page, or really any other page, and so let me just open this one here in a new tab. So, if we now go back, we should see that cookie here. And indeed, here it is. So this is the cookie that was just sent into our application by loading that page in the browser. And if I do that again, then you will see another one, right? So here it is. And so now we can use this in order to protect our routes. All right, so let's try that out. Okay, but before we can do that, we need in our auth controller to actually add that in here as well. So right now we're only reading the JSON Web Token from the authorization header, right? And only if they start with this bearer, okay? So for the bearer token. But now we basically also want to read the JSON Web Token from a cookie. And so what we can do here is basically an else if. So if there was no token in the authorization header, well, then let's take a look at the cookies. So request.cookies.JSON Web Token. So JWT, which is the name of the cookie, and so therefore in the cookies object, there will be a property called JWT. So this here, right? And so if this exists, well, then the token should be exactly that. So request.cookies.jwt. Okay. And so now with this, we're also able to authenticate users based on tokens sent via cookies, and not only the authorization header. Great. And just to test this out, let's actually protect one of our routes here in the view. And I will do that with this tour detail page. Okay, so that's just for testing, because of course it doesn't make much sense, but I just wanted to show you that as it is right now, our login is already working. So let's import the auth controller here. And then, just like before, add it here into this route. So auth controller dot protect. And so this is nothing new at this point. And then only if the user is logged in, we can go to the get tour. Great. So what I'm going to do now is to basically delete this cookie first, just to show you what happens when a non-logged in user tries to access that route now. And so basically, if we remove this cookie, it is like logging out the user, right? So if we now take a look at our tours, then that should look just fine. But if we now try to access this page, we should get an error. And indeed, there it is, saying that you are not logged in. Fair enough. So let's go back and let's actually log in. Okay, so here we go. And then in the future, we will of course also implement like some alert windows here and all that good stuff. But for now, again, let's just make it work. And so you see that we're back to having our nice cookie here. Okay, and so let's now try to access this protected route. And indeed, now it works. Fantastic, that's really great already, right? Now, ideally, when a user is logged in, we then want not to display these buttons here, but instead like some user menu or a picture of the user. So basically showing that the user is actually logged in, right? So let's do that in the next video, along with bundling all our JavaScript files together in the front end, as I was explaining earlier. So don't wait, let's move straight to the next one. See you there.